Okay, good morning, everyone. A couple of announcements before we get started this morning. There is an Embodied Intelligence conference being held at Cambridge University. The first day was yesterday, second day is today, third day is tomorrow. It's being held virtually at Cambridge University in the UK. Free registration. So if you're looking for something to do in between classes, you can check out embodied-intelligence.org. And here's a look at the schedule. I spoke at the conference yesterday. Today, this is in Greenwich Mean Time, so I think we missed some of the morning talks. But around midday, you should be able to catch some of the afternoon session. I will just point out a few names here. Joanna Bryson does some amazing work on bio-inspired robotics. We talked about bio-inspired robotics right at the beginning of the course when we were looking at the landscape of AI and robotics. Bio-inspired robotics tends to focus on the products of evolution, taking a particular organism and trying to build it in a robotic form. Evolutionary robotics, of course, focuses not on the products of evolution, but the process of evolution. Another great talk to catch, which I think you should be able to catch, is Rob Wood's talk. Professor Wood is faculty at Harvard University, does some amazing work with soft robotics, miniature robotics. They're getting close to making a flying robot that's about the size of a housefly. Pretty amazing robotics. And then tomorrow, there'll be some talks in the morning to be able to catch our Asian colleagues there in Japan. A couple of talks from some Japanese researchers on their work in robotics in particular and embodied intelligence in general. Free registration, it's on Zoom. If you got a moment, I suggest checking it out. Okay, back to evolutionary robotics. We are working our way through some open problems in the field. We talked about modularity last week. We talked about the competing conventions problem and the NEAT algorithm, which was designed to solve it. And then we finished last time by talking about HyperNEAT, which was designed to solve a particular problem, which is when we send our evolutionary algorithm out to go searching for potential solutions in the space of all given solutions to our problem. In our case, that's usually the space of all possible neural controllers for our robot, or if we broaden our evolutionary algorithm to evolve body and brain together, it's the space of all possible robots. The vast majority of the solutions in that space have no symmetry, no repetition, no regularity whatsoever. They're a random collection of parts or a random distribution of synaptic weights. The vast majority of unordered things tend not to produce good behavior. So HyperNEAT was designed to constrain or bias the evolutionary algorithm to hop among the space of all possible solutions, among the vanishingly small subset of solutions that have some kind of regularity in them, and then look within that subset for the subset of solutions that solve your problem. Yeah? Okay, we're going to switch today and talk about probably the most visible open problem in the field, which is the the reality gap, or crossing the sim to real gap. I'm pretty sure all of you by now are convinced that whatever your robot has evolved to do, if I set you up in the Fab Lab over in the Voti Hall, even if you're able to build a version of it, it's unlikely to do what you're seeing in the simulation, right? We're going to talk about a number of solutions over the years that have been proposed to solve this problem. All of them are admittedly partial solutions to that problem. There's still a lot of good work to be done in the area of sim to real. Okay, you are working on your 10th and final assignment. You're turning your minimal robot into a quadruped. Any questions about assignment 10? We'll talk about the final project on Tuesday. Oh, all good. Okay, so I want to go back to lecture 14 just for a moment. There was one last slide that I wanted to discuss, which reinforces our discussion about NEAT. We ended last time by looking at all of the possible mutations that occur in the run of HyperNEAT, and we saw that a lot of these mutations have big effects. The child has much higher fitness or much lower fitness than the parent. The fact that the magnitude is large and has a big negative effect should be no surprise, right? Going in with a sledgehammer. What is surprising is these points up here, right? These are large positive mutations. This is looking at all of the mutations that are occurring during the hyperneat runs and during the fixed topology neat runs. These are the control experiment we looked at. Let's switch from looking at mutations to crossover events. Now what we're going to look at is all the times in a run of hyperneat when two parents were chosen. Those two networks were combined by the neat algorithm to produce a child network. And we can then ask the following question. When we assess the fitness of a child, is that fitness worse than the fitness of both parents? Is it better than one parent, worse than another? Or is the fitness of the child better than both parents? That's what these three trajectories correspond to. So we have evolutionary time on the horizontal axis as before. Vertical axis is going to be the fraction of individuals in a given generation that were produced by crossover, and that were, let's pick one of these lines here. Let's pick the green line here. This is the fraction of children that were produced that were worse than both parents. Most of the time it was about 15% of the children had a fitness that was worse than both parents. The red line corresponds to the children that had a fitness that was similar to the parents. The fitness of the child was better than one parent and worse than another. It's about more than 50% of the offspring had that property. And then what are we missing? The purple line here. These are the children that were produced that had better fitness than both parents. So if we focus on just these solid lines for a moment, here's some evidence that NEAT is working, right? Remember, NEAT is kind of fixing crossover in evolutionary algorithm. It increases the probability at some times, and actually quite a bit of the time, a crossover event will produce a child that brings together good genetic material from both parents. Make sense? Okay. All right, that was the last thing I wanted to say about NEAT and hyperneat. Let's shift gears now and talk about the sim to real problem. And we're going to start with the first proposed solution to crossing the reality gap, which has the relatively cool sounding name of the radical envelope of noise hypothesis. Okay. Here's a modern version of this process. As we're going to see, the noise hypothesis was proposed back in 1997. It was sort of rebranded by NVIDIA in 2018. NVIDIA referred to it as domain randomization. Domain meaning the domain that the robot, the task or the domain in which the robot is operating. May be difficult to see from this picture, but you can see obviously NVIDIA showing off some of its hardware, that it's able to simulate a vast number of very detailed robots in simulation simultaneously. Can anybody see what task the robot is trying to solve? A little tricky to see from this picture. Sometimes you can figure it out. What's the robot trying to do?
He's trying to put the cylinder in the cube.
Absolutely. So it's dangling a cylinder on a string and trying to get the cylinder inside a little cylindrical hole in the blue cube. Actually, it's not a trivial task. If you look carefully, you'll notice that the blue boxes are all different. You'll notice also that the size of the cylinders are all different. And it may not be obvious in this picture, but the robots themselves are also very slightly different. Some of the hands are a little bit narrower, a little bit thicker. They are adding noise to the robot. We actually saw an example of this a little while back, where the investigators were actually introducing manufacturing noise. Right? When they built the robot in the simulator, they were building things a little bit longer, a little bit shorter, a little bit rounder. Where did we see that before?
Not only like the bipedal robots.
Absolutely, right? So when we were looking at the evolution of passive and then hybrid dynamic locomotion. They were introducing a bit of noise to make sure that the biped would be able to continue walking even if its mass distribution is a little bit different. So we're going to look at the origin of all of this idea of what's sometimes known as sprinkling noise into the simulator. There's lots of different places we can place noise. Okay. So as promised, this was reported back in 1997, 3 years before physics engines started to appear on the scene. So the simulator in which they added noise, as we'll see in a moment, is very minimal. The observation the researchers made in this case is that if you do evolution in simulation, it will tend to create neural controllers that exploit details of the simulation. I'm guessing that most of you have already come across this in your own experiments so far. Anybody seen this in their evolutionary runs with the hill climber, the parallel hill climber? There's one way I'm pretty sure that evolution is already exploiting your robot or the simulator in an unreasonable way.
Well, I've seen it sometimes just lean back on one cube and then just kick forward. It's kind of like doing a unicycle or something.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So everything is very symmetric, right? The cubes are perfectly bilaterally symmetric. The mass distribution of your robot is perfectly bilaterally symmetric. Nothing is perfectly symmetric in the real world. What about the motors?
The cubes like clip into each other all the time.
Okay, so there's a lot of self-collision, self-overlap, which of course doesn't make sense unless you make your robot out of soft parts, and maybe the deformation is a close approximation to self-intersection. That's clearly inaccurate. Whether the evolutionary algorithm is exploiting that or not, maybe yes, maybe no. What about the motors? If I gave you a couple weeks in the fab lab with an engineer who knew what they were doing and you worked together, what's the main thing that would stop your physical robot doing what you see your virtual robot doing?
Apparently motors don't actually take like up physical space. They're just kind of like a force that acts between the two cubes.
Absolutely, right? They don't actually exist. They have no physical extent. They have no mass. Motors are definitely one of the heaviest components of traditional robotics. What else?
You can tell it to exert however much force up until like the max.
Absolutely.
Normal motors can.
Absolutely. The max, you probably get some Pepe Le Pew pronking, right? That is very difficult to do with robotics unless you work at Boston Dynamics and you strap a diesel engine onto your robot, right? The motors in the simulation are probably much stronger than in reality, and definitely your evolutionary algorithm is exploiting that fact, right? Okay, so, which is kind of good, right? That's the whole point of using an evolutionary algorithm. Evolution is an exploiter, a sufficer. It will make use of whatever you give it. However, if those details that it's exploiting, like motor strength or the fact that a motor has no mass, if there's no corresponding detail in reality, then of course, it doesn't matter how good your robot does in simulation, it's going to fall flat, literally and figuratively, in reality, right? Okay, so the hypothesis put forward here is by adding noise or random change to various details in the simulator, that's going to kind of poison that detail from the point of view of evolution. It's not going to try and exploit it because it can't rely on it. However, what do we add noise to? If we add too much noise, then obviously evolution can't make any progress because there's nothing to latch onto. This question, answering this question about what details to noisify, is an open problem. In my professional opinion, no one has a good answer to what exactly should be noisified and what should be constant across simulated robots or simulated trials that allows evolution to exploit that constancy. Very difficult to answer this well. Okay, so in this case, they came up with something that in retrospect seems kind of obvious. If the simulation is overly complicated, then there are many things have to be noisified. Friction, mass distribution. We haven't actually talked about friction in the physics engine, but if you punch through into PyroSim and then punch through into PyBullet, you can actually get into altering the friction properties of your robot and the floor. You can virtually wrap sandpaper around your robot, or put it on the floor, or make it smooth. Mass distribution, something else you can play around with down in the engine room of PyBullet. The geometry of the objects themselves, joint properties. There's other aspects of the hinge joints that you've been working with that you can alter, sensors, motors, and on and on and on and on. So in this case, they said, well, instead of trying to noisify all these details of a complicated simulator, let's just create a minimal simulator, something that's very, very simple and is actually missing a lot of these details. Not only are they not wrong, they're just not there at all, which is a little bit anti-intuitive. If there is, in reality, obviously there is friction, mass distribution, geometry, and so on. So if we're evolving things in a minimal simulation in which none of these things exist, how can that increase the probability that something is going to transfer from simulation to reality? It's a little bit non-intuitive. As we saw when we talked about minimal cognition, making minimal things is a kind of a good place to start from a scientific point of view. It helps us to understand how cognitive behavior starts to arise. But in sim to real, this is a purely engineering exercise, right? We're trying to create useful machines in reality. Does it make sense to create a minimal simulation? Okay. Which is just short for a simulation that contains as little physical details as possible. Okay. Here's a figure from one of my papers. We're actually going to talk about this experiment, I think, next week. Here you can see a relatively complicated simulation. I was using a physics engine back in 2006 at this point. I'd created a model of this particular robot here. What you're watching is some freeze frames of one of the evolved neural controllers controlling the robot. And you'll notice that most of the time, this one is actually very, very good. We put a lot of effort into this experiment. We got most of the details of the simulator and the robot right. It was a pretty good match. We pretty much crossed the reality gap in this case. Even in this relatively successful case, there are a few hiccups. You'll notice, so what I'm showing here is almost, let's see, I think there's one complete gate cycle going from 0 seconds to 3.7 seconds. So in this case, every 3.7 seconds, the robot is completing one gate cycle. You'll notice halfway through that gate cycle, there is a mismatch between simulation and reality. I'll play the video for you next week, but what this robot is doing, as you can see just before the hiccup, is it's raising its front and back leg and kind of balancing on its left and right leg. And in reality, it tips forward and then keeps moving. In the simulation, it tips backwards, and then the legs do something to allow it to keep moving. So this hiccup didn't derail the simulation, didn't derail the utility or usefulness of this neural controller. But even when we cross the gap, there are still inaccuracies. Doesn't matter how good a model is, it's never going to be a perfect reflection of reality. So it's unlikely we're ever going to get a perfect match from what we see in simulation and reality. Given what you can see, and I know you can't see much detail about the physical robot here, or the simulated robot for that case, why this hiccup? Why this particular difference at this point in time? We just talked about some of the details in a physics engine. We're obviously using a physics engine here. What do you think we got wrong in this case? Momentum? Yeah, so the momentum is off at this point in time, that's true. But we are not dictating momentum. Remember, it's the physics engine that computes momentum. Actually in this case, what did I put in there that was wrong?
Does it matter that it looks like from the image to the actual picture, it looks mirrored, like flipped?
It looks flipped, so that's because in the simulated robot, it's fallen backwards and is resting on its back leg. Mm-hmm. And in reality, at this moment, at the same moment in time, it's tipped forward and resting on its front leg. Why?
Could it just be like a very small difference in the center of mass?
Bingo. The mass distribution is a little bit off. Again, we'll go into more details about this experiment later, but you can see that The simulated robot is radially symmetric. So if you go around in a circle, it all looks the same. The physical robot, on the main body, there's a small battery in there, there's some electronics. So the mass distribution inside the torso of this quadruped is not symmetric. The mass distribution is slightly different. It's very, very little. And for most of this gait, because the robot is actually keeping a relatively low center of mass, it doesn't matter, but you can see some of the repercussions of even slight differences between sim and real having a behavioral impact. Okay. All right, so back to the radical envelope of noise hypothesis. In this case, what the investigators did was to look at different features of the model or the simulation and break it into two sets. They named the first set the base set. These are the details that are going to have some basis in reality. If you go back to this, for example, the base set might be the fact that the robot has 4 legs. And mass distribution also, but it's going to be slightly different in reality. There is then an implementation set of interactions, and the implementation set contain details in the simulation that are going to be absolutely non-physical. They don't exist in reality. Like, for example, self-intersections. That's something that happens in the simulation that is not physically possible in reality, right? Soft things can come into contact with one another and deform one another, but solid objects cannot pass through one another. That is a no-no. In this case, that detail would be placed in the implementation set of simulated interactions. Okay, so in simulation, what they're going to do, as we'll see in a moment, is they sprinkled a little bit of noise on the base set. So in our case, if mass distribution is in the base set, they would slightly alter the mass distribution of the simulated robot from one simulation to the next. And in the implementation set, those details that are known to be wrong, they're going to put 100% noise. They're going to really vary that detail. I don't know how that would work with self-intersection, but imagine that whenever something does self-intersect in the physics engine, they're going to really noisify that. They're going to either create a huge amount of intersection, they're going to push those objects apart with a lot of force, they're going to pull objects together with a lot of force. They're going to vary that event, that self-interaction, by a huge amount so that evolution cannot rely on it during evolution. Okay. All right. We're back to the late 90s, pre-physics engines, so we're back to our simulated and physical Kepra. 2 wheels, one left, one right. We've got 6 infrared sensors on the front and 2 infrared sensors on the back, and we have a 7th and 8th sensor, which is going to sense ambient light. I'm sorry, this should say ambient light sensor. So we've got 8 sensors, 2 motors. We're going to wire up the 8 sensors to sensor neurons, the 8 sensor neurons to the 2 motor neurons, very much like we've seen before. Pretty straightforward. The task, in this case, is the T-maze. This is a very old traditional experiment dating back to cognitive science and psychology in the 1950s and the 1940s before that. Usually it's a rat placed into a T-maze. In this case, we're going to be placing our simulated and physical Kepra into a T-maze. In this case, the task is for the animal, or in this case the robot, to move up the stem of the T, and as it does, from either the right or the left, there's going to be a small flash of light, and the animal or the robot has to remember which side the light was on, and then turn towards that side. And if it turns and moves down the correct top side of the T, the rat would get a little bit of cheese, and in the case of our robot, it's going to get a few fitness points. Yeah? Okay, I just want to pause here for a moment. The assumption of the T-maze task is to test an animal or a robot for ability to retain memory. We've spent quite a bit of time talking about embodied cognition in this course so far. that the body supports cognition. It's not necessarily an obstruction. Turns out that this isn't quite true. An animal or a robot can cheat in this task and not have to remember. How? An important detail while you're thinking about this is by the time the organism or the robot gets to the T junction, the light has long since been turned off. There is no sensory stimulation. There's no sensory stimulation possible in the junction that would give the robot or the animal a hint about which way to turn.
They have a really slow reaction.
Possibly. So you could start turning the moment you see the light so that you turn into the top of the T. Is that what you mean?
Kind of like
Yep.
if they saw it, but then they didn't remember it, but it was more like they just reacted very slowly. And I don't mean like turning immediately, more like they saw it and it just took a while for them to realize they should turn.
Okay. If it takes a while for them to start turning,
Maybe
that's memory,
Okay.
right? Any other ideas?
I'll say they just guess.
They could guess. Okay, so you get the cheese half the time, or you get fitness points half the time. Doesn't cut it. Turns out there's a way you can cheat, so you get the answer 100% of the time.
Whatever side it sees the light on, it'll just turn and then hit the wall and continue going forwards constantly, and then so once it reaches the edge of the T, it'll just go straight.
Bingo. That's it, right? Exploit your interaction with the world, right? Whichever side I'm hugging, by the time I get to the junction, I'm going to turn in that direction, right? I've mentioned this many times before. Embodied cognition is the trick or the hack of pushing against the world and observing how the world pushes back, right? By exploiting your interaction with the world, you can get away with seemingly intelligent behavior like looking like you remember when you actually don't. The body, and more specifically the way you exploit your interaction with the world, is the foundation of intelligence. That's the hypothesis that most roboticists and those working in embodied cognition hold. Very different from traditional neuroscientific approaches, which assume memory, assume you need a lot of brain in order to solve the problem. Okay, that detail is not important for our discussion today, just a reminder and reinforcement of that fact. Okay, so imagine you created a T-maze in PyBullet, and you set up this experiment. A reasonable fitness function is D1 plus D2 plus 100, where D1 is the amount of time that you move up the stem, and then D2 is the amount of time, or amount of distance you move down either of the two tops of the T. So there's reward for turning and choosing one path at the top. You get an extra 100 points if the direction you turned and moved in for D2 was the correct direction. Imagine you take one neural controller, you drop it into the robot multiple times, you evaluate that controllable multiple times in a simulation, and you randomly flash either the left or the right light, and you integrate those Fs over those simulations. You should be able to evolve a robot that solves the T-maze. T-maze isn't really that difficult a problem. The problem is that if you have a Kepra that has infrared sensors, and infrared sensors, remember, send out a beam of infrared light, it hits an object and reflects. That makes sense most of the time if the infrared beam hits at more or less a direct angle and bounces back to you. Imagine the Kepra when it's sitting in the junction here. It's got 6 infrared beams emanating from the front of the robot, 2 from the back. They're bouncing around inside this area. Most of that reflected light doesn't make it back to you. Some of that reflected light that hits infrared I is actually light that was emitted by infrared J, one of your other sensors. If your vision is based on infrared reflectance, this is a very difficult thing to see. It's very difficult to know where you are. It's very difficult to simulate. So in this experiment, they didn't. They broke the T-maze into 2 pieces, the stem of the T and the top of the T. They evaluated the robot moving up the stem of the T, and if a particular controller got the robot far enough up the stem of the T that it entered the junction here, they would teleport that robot to this position in the top of the T, and any infrared beams that headed backwards down into the stem of the T just returned 100% noise. They just put a completely random number on that infrared sensor. In a sense, evolution could not rely on any infrared light entering the junction. Okay. And then they evaluated whether it moved to the right or the left, D2, and then 100 extra points if you went in the right direction. Make sense? So there is no way that the evolutionary algorithm can exploit any sensory information it gets in the junction, because it never does. Okay. This is the most minimal simulation we're going to see in this entire course. It's 2 spreadsheets. It's 2 lookup tables. The first one, table 1, they looked up the robot's current orientation. It's a flat Kepra here, so it can only rotate in 2 dimensions. The robot's orientation, they looked at the speeds that were being sent to the 2 wheels. They took the orientation, the position of the robot, how it was moving, and they would simply update the X and Y position of the robot given that information. So they're just updating the position and orientation of the robot based on its current position and orientation. No F equals ma, no momentum, no friction, no mass distribution. Very, very simple movement. The second table was a lookup table that would take as input the robot's current orientation and distance from the wall. How close to the wall was it? And what was its angle relative to the closest wall? And instead of simulating an infrared beam, they would just convert that length to a sensor value. So they weren't really even simulating infrared very well. Turns out that it was good enough when they sent these evolved controllers to the physical Kepra. Very, very simple. No physics engine, no 2D simulation, just updating positions and orientations of a robot based on 2 lookup tables. Okay. Let's look at the base set and the implementation set in this case. Even in this simple simulation, there are some things that evolution should not rely on. The base set was how the robot moves in response to motor signals. So in table 1, when table 1 provided back the new position of the robot, they put 10% noise. They put a little bit of noise on those X and Y values. How the infrared sensors responded when we got back from the second lookup table the new values of the sensors. They put a little bit of noise on those infrared sensors, and same thing with the ambient light sensors. They measured the average distance between the robot and the light source when the light was turned on, and sprinkled a little bit of noise on that as well. Evolution has to rely on infrared sensors, the ambient light sensors, that the motors cause a particular change in position. So that goes into the base set. The implementation set, as we just talked about, is how the infrared sensors behave in the T-junction. If any infrared beam enters the junction, gets back 100% noise. Pretty straightforward. Okay. Some other implementation details. These are actually base set here. The side from which the light comes from, we just talked about this, either at the left or the right. They varied the width of the corridor every time any robot came down the corridor. The starting robot's orientation at the bottom of the base of the T, the length of the light zone, so how wide was the aperture through which the light was coming, the length of the corridor, pretty much everything they could think of. So they're sprinkling noise as broadly as possible. Okay. Again, as I mentioned, pretty straightforward neural network. We've seen this before. There's a couple of recurrent and self connections here. So if evolution chooses to try and evolve robots that remember the light source rather than cheating and hugging the wall, there is neural real estate available to retain information. They fixed bilateral symmetry. We've seen this before. They assumed bilateral symmetry was useful, a good assumption to make, and then evolved synaptic weights. They also fixed whether or not any individual synapse was excitatory or inhibitory. There's a little bit of intuition here given Bratenberg vehicles, right? There's a little detail here that I just want to point out that's kind of interesting. If we look at the two light sensors over here, here's the left ambient light sensor, the right ambient light sensor. You'll notice that they connected these sensor neurons together with inhibitory connections. This is known in neuroscience as mutual inhibition. It turns out that in most nervous systems, sensory systems, in your nervous system, there are a lot of these motifs or these patterns where one neuron inhibits another neuron, and that neuron in turn inhibits the first neuron, or parts of the nervous system that mutually inhibit one another. Why is this such a common pattern? It is a negative. It is absolutely a negative feedback loop. Mother Nature discovered negative feedback loop and uses them all over the place. Why is it useful in this particular case? We're mutually inhibiting the sensor neurons that are connected to the two ambient light sensors.
Can I give an idea of like a time from the last perception of light?
Possibly. Could be. As often with neural networks, it might be doing additional things. This was a detail that was fixed by the investigators. What was their intuition here? What were they trying to help evolution with? The value of a sensor neuron is obviously being influenced by the sensor itself. Right, here we have the ambient sensor itself coming into this sensor neuron, but there is also a second incoming connection, which is this inhibitory connection from another neuron. What's the idea here? What do you think happens with mutually inhibited sensor neurons? It is definitely a negative feedback loop. How is that helpful?
It helps the robot choose one side, because if one of them has a higher light value, it's going to immediately shut the other side down.
Absolutely. So imagine a point in time the left ambient light sensor is seeing relative darkness, and the right ambient sensor passes by the light source, which is on the right-hand side. There is stronger inhibition of this neuron on this one, and this one more weakly inhibits this one. So if this one is strongly inhibited, let's imagine that this one drops by quite a bit. This one is also inhibited by a little bit, but it's only inhibited by a little bit. So let's say it drops by a little bit. The difference is now much greater, right? They're arm wrestling, and this one is starting to lose, right? This one barely inhibits this one anymore. So at the next time step, this one, which is still very strongly inhibiting this one, drops even further. And even if the light is now shut off, the robot remembers which side the light was coming from. Yeah? Mutual inhibition.
It looks like on sensor 1 and 4, they have connections to themselves that are inhibitory.
Yep.
Is there like an intuition for what that
But there might be. It's beyond me. And I've read this paper many times. They didn't explain it either. If anybody figures it out, please let me know. Seems like an arbitrary detail to me. Okay. Again, sort of pre-physics engines, pre-fancy robots. Here's the relatively simple Kepra. Let's have a look at the top left panel here. Here's where the Kepra was placed. They put a little LED on the top of the robot, turned off the lights in the lab, and recorded this light trace. And we can see, if you look carefully, there are several light traces here. So they dropped the Kepra back in the stem of the T and replayed it with the same evolved neural controller multiple times. And the robot consistently turned to the left when the light source came from the left. And the same evolved neural controller. When the light was on the right, the robot turned to the right. It does not look, to me at least, like the robot is turning and hugging the wall. So is the robot remembering or is it cheating? Maybe. Looks like it's remembering, right? There's no particular, seemingly no behavioral change from our distal perspective. Remember our discussion about distal and proximal perspectives? However, from the robot's point of view, it may not be hugging the wall, but there's probably an infinite number of other ways in which it can cheat. Some subtle behavioral change. Maybe it slows down. And if it's moving at X meters per second by the time it gets to the junction, that means turn left. And if it's moving at Y meters per second, that means turn right. It's another way it can possibly cheat. Right? There's a lot of these details. So thinking about thinking is misleading. Just because it looks like it's remembering doesn't necessarily mean that it's remembering. Okay. You can see in reality they also changed a few details. They reran the same evolved controller with a wider T-stem. Robot still seems to do a pretty good job. There's a little bit of variation. What did they alter in the bottom two panels? There's one other detail here of the relationship between the robot and the environment that they modified in this bottom pair of panels. What was it?
Kind of seems to avoid the center of the pathway. I can't tell why.
Yeah. So right at the bottom of the base of the T, you can see there are these two clumps of trajectories. Why? What did they alter?
Change the starting position.
The starting orientation of the robot. Half of the time it's pointing front left up the stem of the T. The other half of the time it's pointing upright, forward right up the stem of the T. Yeah. Okay. Very simple experiment, but the very first successful crossing of the reality gap. Evolve neural controllers in simulation, transfer to reality, and it succeeds. Yeah? Okay. In a very simple task on a simple robot, so this was clearly not the be-all, end-all solution. So we'll skip ahead here to the next attempt. Their envelope of noise hypothesis was published in 1997. 3 years later, in the year 2000, the Golem Project was published. This particular experiment caused a lot of noise and got a lot of attention and is the only evolutionary robotics experiment to date that ended up as the lead story on the front page of the New York Times. We were hoping that the Xenobots 20 years later was going to do the same thing. We didn't. We made it to page 4. Didn't make it to the front page, but there you go. Okay. Scientists report they have made a robot that makes its own robots. Some of you may have already heard of the Golem Project before. If you have, hold on to your answer for a moment. What's the other robot? What did they mean? As usual, the science reporters are sensationalizing the actual science. We haven't talked about the Golem Project yet. There's a picture of some of the robots produced by the Golem Project. What do they mean by a robot that makes other robots? Those are the robots. What's the robot they're talking about that made these robots?
Was it a simulator that could mess with like the body structure?
There is a simulator that's going to evolve the body structure, but a science reporter is probably not going to interpret a physics engine, which was just starting to appear in the year 2000. What was the other detail? What was the other component of this experiment, do you think, that the science reporter interpreted as a robot?
Was it a 3D printer?
3D printer. So 3D printers were restricted to Department of Defense and aerospace labs at about this time. This work was conducted by Hod Lipson at Cornell University. I went to go work with Hod a few years after this. Hod was one of the very first researchers that had a 3D printer in his lab. And they used that 3D printer to print parts of this robot. So a 3D printer printing parts for a robot. From the point of view of a science reporter, this was the beginning of Skynet, right? Robots making robots. The end is nigh. Okay. All right. So We are actually going to talk about robots making robots and robot self-replication. Here's an old cartoon from a NASA report back in the 1980s. The idea of robots making robots has actually been around for a very long time, dates all the way back to 1948. John von Neumann, one of the pioneers of the computer age, said, imagine a machine that can reach out in its environment and either find other robot components or find raw materials, combine those raw materials together into robot components, combine those robot components together to make another robot, and so on and so forth. This is just, again, a teaser for robot self-replication, which we'll talk about, I think, in about 2 weeks. Okay. This was not, the Golem Project was not robot self-replication. The experiment started like a very traditional evolutionary robotics experiment. Evolve a robot to locomote in a physics engine. In this case, Hod wrote his own physics engine. They weren't really commercially available at this time. You kind of had to make your own. But it was getting easier to do so with computer technology available in the year 2000. Hod evolved both the body and brain of the robot. So as we reach towards the end of the course, we're going to see more and more experiments where the evolutionary algorithm is modifying body and brain in simulation. We'll talk about how this is done in a moment. The new parts here are obviously step 2 and step 3. Manufacture some parts of these robots using a 3D printer, and the parts that you can't 3D print, snap them in after the fact. Okay. So we're going to use an evolutionary algorithm to evolve robot bodies and brains. In this case, the genotype was a list of lists. It was a list of 4 lists: a vertex list, a bar list, a neuron list, and an actuator list. Each of these 4 lists could be increased and decreased as a result of mutation, like the experiment we just talked about previously. In the vertices list, as you would expect, that list is made up of a list of triplets that dictate the 3-dimensional position of a vertex. The next list, the list of bars, is made up of sets of 4 numbers. The first 2 numbers in each set dictate which 2 vertices that bar connects together, and then relaxed length and stiffness. What does that mean? We've kind of heard this already in a recent experiment we talked about.
We were talking about springs.
Springs. So it's not clear from this picture. They take this rigid bar and cut it in half and then put a little spring inside. So these bars can actually increase and decrease in length. The relaxed length, which is the resting length of the spring. What is the left? If nothing is pulling and pushing on the bar, what length does it like to rest at? And the stiffness, how much force does it take to extend the length of that bar or compress the length of the bar? There's one detail that they actually didn't include here about springs. What is it? Springs need 2 numbers, stiffness and what are we missing? Anybody remember?
Mass.
Sorry?
Mass.
Not mass. Damping, right? So I think they just fixed a default damping for all the springs inside each of the bars. It's not mentioned in the paper, but that's my guess. Okay, I'm going to skip over the neuron list for a moment. I'll come back to that in a moment. The actuator list is which of the bars is actuated. So inside this list of actuators, it's a list of triplets. The first number in each triplet indicates that a particular actuator should be attached to that bar. The actuator is attached to the spring. The actuator is going to pull and push on the spring at the midpoint of the bar. So this is very much now like a piston rather than a hinge joint. The actuator is also going to receive a neuron. So a neuron is going to send out a synapse, or a neuron is going to connect to the actuator, and the value at that neuron is going to dictate how much the actuator is going to pull or push on the spring. A negative neuron value pull on the spring, a positive value, extend or push on the spring. And the bar range is how much it can extend or decrease, extend or compress. The third list here, the neurons list, this is each item in the neurons list obviously specifies a neuron. Each neuron has a particular threshold. This is the activation function. If the raw sum of values, the weighted sum of values arriving at this neuron is above this threshold, it sends out a positive value. If the weighted sum arriving at this neuron is below this threshold, it sends out a negative value. And then there are a whole bunch of values that follow the threshold value, which are the weights, this should say synaptic weights of the connections or synapses that are arriving at the neuron. This is kind of an odd way to do things. You'll notice that there's no synapse list. The way this works, as you'll see in a moment, is mutations can add a neuron. When we copy, if we choose a surviving robot, we copy this genotype, and a mutation hits the neuron list, and that mutation adds a neuron to the neuron list. That neuron is added to this robot's neural network, and it also adds a whole bunch of synapses from all the other existing neurons to arrive at that neuron. So a mutation that adds neurons, it automatically gets fully wired up into the neural network. It's kind of an arbitrary detail, doesn't matter too much for our purposes. Okay. Any questions about that? It's different ways we can encode a genotype to allow evolution to tinker with body and brain together. This is one of the early attempts to do so. Okay. Let's have a look at the evolutionary details here. They have a population of 200 initially null genotypes, meaning they have a list of 4 lists where each of those 4 lists has 0 elements in it. Kind of a strange detail. Instead of starting with random robots, they started with null robots. We'll see why in a moment. Fitness is what we've seen before, displacement of the center of mass. The robot should move as quickly as possible during a fixed time period. The evaluation period, the number of time steps that they ran in the simulation, is, as they reported in the paper, is a fixed number, 12. 12 cycles of the neural control of the robot. What do they mean by cycles? Gives you a hint about some of the details of these neurons we haven't discussed yet. 12 cycles of neural control.
Like it goes through the sensing act cycle. Is that for 12 times?
It could be. That's a good guess. It's actually, they weren't very clear here. Turns out that they tag one of these neurons as a CPG. What does a CPG do? Sends out an oscillatory signal at some frequency that I'm assuming they picked. And it has to go through 12 of those oscillations, and then they stop the simulation. Okay. All right. Let's have a look at the mutations here. In your code base at the moment, you have only one type of mutation. Pick a synapse at random and assign a new random weight to that synapse. In this experiment, there were 10 different mutations that were possible. So during evolution, if a surviving genotype was chosen for mutation, they would copy that genotype, and then they would roll a 10-sided die. They'd generate a random number between 1 and 10. And depending on what that number was, they would then apply that particular modification to that genotype, to that copied genotype. Yeah? Okay. Some of these mutations change the body, some change the brain, some change the relationship between body and brain. First one, change the length of a bar. Oh, I'm sorry, I said it was a 10-sided die. It wasn't. They actually weighted the die. Some of these mutation operators happened a little more often than other ones. Some of these mutation events on purpose were made more rare than others. 10% of the time, a mutation would increase or decrease the length of a randomly chosen bar. 10% of the time, it would choose a given synapse inside the neural controller, change its synaptic weight. Very rarely, it would add or remove a dangling bar, so there was some bar that wasn't really connected up. 5 or 6, it would add or remove an unconnected neuron. 7, split a vertex into 2 and add a small bar between the 2 new vertices. Number 8, split the bar into 2 segments and then add a vertex at the midpoint of these 2 new smaller bars. And 9 and 10, pick a random neuron and attach it to a bar, which means actually attach it, this is short for attach it to an actuator that is actuating a bar. So 9 and 10 are altering the connection between body and brain. Add a neuron to an actuator, which is controlling a spring inside a bar, or choose a neuron that's already attached to an actuator that's actuating a spring inside a bar and delete that connection. Make sense? Okay. I'm going to give you a minute or two to work your way through this little cartoon at the bottom. What's to the left of this first arrow is a null phenotype. If we have a null genotype that specifies no vertices, no bars, no neurons, and no, what am I missing? No actuators, you get no robot. A mutation to a null genotype can change it into a non-null genotype that produces a non-null phenotype. What's the mutation that turned this robot into this robot? Which number here? Number 3, add a dangling bar. There's our dangling bar, right? So that's the mutation that changed this into this. I want you to take a minute and think about what mutations changed this into this, then this into this. In some of these cases, there was more than one mutation that occurred. I'll give you a moment to think about that, and then we'll see what you came up with. Okay, what changed this robot into this robot? 1. Yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. Increase the length of the bar. This one? Add a neuron. This one?
Change the length of the bar and add.
And add, when we added this new one here, you see it also added in a synapse that connected the original neuron to the new neuron. How about this one? Add another neuron. There's this negative synapse here. Let's see, is that right?
Yeah,
The negative, okay. How did the body change?
did it split one bar into 2?
Absolutely, right? So where's that here? Split, number 7, split the vertex, split this vertex into 2 vertices here, and add a small bar between them. Yep, and so on. Okay, so you can imagine, again, hitting this genotype with various mutations that elaborate the body or the brain. Why did they start with a population of null robots rather than a population of random robots? They could have created a random genotype by picking 10 or 20 mutation events and hitting a null genotype to turn it into a random robot and create 200 to start.
And this way they'd all have sort of a common ancestor because they all have a similar starting point.
Possible, yeah. So they're going to be similar to one another because they all have actually a common ancestor, which is the null robot. Why else might they have chosen to start with null robots rather than random robots?
Do they not want to like accidentally give it a bias for how the evolution would go based on the initial shape?
Yeah, getting closer. Yeah, of course, right? If we make some relatively large, complicated random robots, we're definitely biasing evolution. We're also biasing it towards something else here, starting with null. Remember that this is now an engineering exercise, right? The Golem Project was designed to try and cross the reality gap using 3D printing. A lot of the design decisions in this experiment are coming from an engineer, not a scientist. Why start with null genotypes rather than random genotypes?
It's like the thing like thinking about thinking.
Misleading?
Misleading,
Yeah. How is it thinking about thinking is misleading here? How does that apply?
It allows it to build itself, and it'll probably come up with a solution that's way better for itself.
Okay, so it turns out that starting with null genotypes tends to produce better solutions than if they had started with random robots. But what does better mean here?
It's like it's going to be less complex and have fewer parts, so it'll be easier to build.
Bingo, right? So generally speaking, the solutions are going to be simpler if you start with nothing. They're going to be simpler, and as you mentioned, they're going to be easier to build. There's much less things that can go wrong between sim and reality, right? As we just saw in the radical envelope of noise experiment, which was 3 years before this experiment, and also the minimal cognition experiments, which also emphasized simplicity. Okay. Again, I apologize for the quality of these images. Here is a sample through one generation of evolutionary time. So we had 200 robots in the population. We have 200 robots in the population at any moment in evolutionary time. We're looking at not all 200, but a sample of them. What can you tell me about this sample? What jumps out at you?
That seems like they don't get really more than kind of four. If they're in that sort of pyramid shape, it's not really more than four legs.
Absolutely. There's a lot of this tetrahedral shape. There's 4 pieces, maybe 5 pieces, maybe 6. Pretty simple. Not a lot of moving pieces here, which is good. What else jumps out at you?
There's almost like speciation, like there's kind of 2 main robot bodies that it's figured out.
You'll notice there's kind of 2 species that seem to be emerging in this particular evolutionary run. Somebody mentioned that if we start with 200 null genotypes, they kind of all have a common ancestor. So they tend to be similar to one another, which is, again, a deliberate design choice in this experiment, right? They're going to try and build some of these things better that they should be kind of similar to one another. Okay, here's now cutting not vertically down through a population at a given point in evolutionary time. Here's a cut through an evolving population horizontally, meaning here's the best robot in the population at a given point in time, at generation 4, 13, 26, 27, generation 36, generation 50, 60, and then all the way down to this particular robot in generation 198. What's happening here? What jumps out at you at this case? In this case, we're now looking over evolutionary time.
Can you more develop a kind of straight line segment to the right and like a very more defined like cube or rectangle bounding box in that bottom left portion?
Okay, yeah, so it looks like it's kind of fine-tuning this basic pattern that actually dates all the way back to generation 4. There's not a lot of morphological change here, right? It's very, very similar body. Let's go back to a moment and look at have a look at the mutation events here. You'll notice that the ones that change, most of the changes to the body are rare, with the exception of changing the length of a bar. So we're not adding and removing physical parts very often, or mutation events are not adding and removing parts very often. There is a bit of a bias in here to tinker with the brain more than evolution should tinker with the body. Kind of makes intuitive sense changes, physical changes to the robot's body are going to have probably a bigger impact on behavior than tinkering with one or a few synaptic weights. Yes?
When it changes the length of a bar, does it have to change the length of multiple bars just because of the nature of how the bars are connected sometimes?
It's a great question. That's a detail that was brought up in previous years. They don't address that. I'm guessing the answer is yes. There are probably some knock-on events of some of these mutations. Yeah, good question. Okay. Okay, somebody mentioned speciation. This is an interesting plot we haven't seen before. Another nice visualization method that you might want to use for your final project. We're showing the phylogenetic trees here of evolving populations. On the vertical axis, going from top to bottom, we have evolutionary time. Usually we've seen evolutionary time going from left to right. So evolutionary time is descending in this picture. If we look at panel A for a moment, every pixel, and you're not actually seeing the pixels, you're seeing the lines here that connect pixels together. Every pixel corresponds to a robot. The horizontal distance between any pair of robots in this visualization is their similarity of ancestry. So two children that share a common parent or parents, they're going to be very close to one another horizontally. Cousins are a little bit more distant, second cousins more distant still, and so on. You'll notice if you look at panel A here, for some reason, one of the null phenotypes produced a non-null robot, and that robot had a lot of offspring. This particular child of that offspring then had a lot of children of its own, and you'll notice these black triangles towards the bottom of panel A corresponds to the two species that was pointed out a moment ago. So you can actually see speciation occurring in some of these runs. It's most pronounced in panel A here. Here we've got our dinosaur robots that are dominating the population for almost 100 generations, but there are a couple of robots that manage to survive in this population for quite a while, and they start to eventually outcompete and drive the robots to extinction, and now we've got this other species that's dominant. You can see extinction events, speciation events. Show these phylogenetic trees borrowed from evolutionary biology can give you a lot more insight into the evolutionary dynamics going on inside your evolving population. I highly recommend giving this a try in your final project. Okay, let's have a look at the things that evolved. We got a couple of quote-unquote snakes, a couple of quote-unquote crabs. Remember, this was a hand-created physics engine. You can see it's got some notable physical inaccuracies, lots of self-collisions. The most important part of this experiment, which, if any of these robots cross the reality gap. Here are 3 of the robots that were actually 3D printed. You'll notice they're a collection of white plastic and some electronics. The white plastic is thermoplastic. Thermoplastic has a relatively low melting point. These early 3D printers, they would take as input a solid thermoplastic. They would heat it up and liquefy it, and a syringe would then extrude a small puddle or a small dot of liquefied plastic that would then very quickly solidify. Print, 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 print. That's why 3D printers are called 3D printers. Instead of depositing ink like a traditional printer, they're depositing thermoplastic, or these days, metal foam, ceramics, living material, you name it. Okay. So let's have a look at the arrow first. This one did an okay job crossing the reality gap. The physical arrow moves about a third as fast as the simulated arrow did. The pusher kind of crossed the gap, not very well, about a quarter of the speed. The tetrahedron was within a tenth of a centimeter of the prediction of the simulation. Any ideas why the tetrahedron did particularly well? Or why the arrow and the pusher did not do as well? I don't know if I can put these on loop for you. I'll keep playing them.
It looks like the top two are getting a lot of their stability by having like most of their body on the floor, where the tetrahedron is stable but not like dragging anything.
Not dragging anything, right? There's a lot of friction being exploited in the case of the arrow and the pusher. Friction is one detail that is particularly difficult to get right in a physical model. The tetrahedron obviously has friction. They put it on thick carpet, so high friction. But you'll notice that this inner bar of the tetrahedron is pushing more vertically than the pushing bars in the arrow and the pusher, meaning that the tetrahedron is lifting most of its mass and placing it back down again, right? That's a relatively safe option when you're not sure about the friction that you're moving over. A few weeks back when you were running to class and you were going over icy patches on campus, you might not be aware of it, but you're switching to a more vertical placement and release of your feet. You do not want to rely on pushing back or pushing forward or pushing to the side if you're not sure whether you're on high friction or low friction surfaces. Yeah? Okay. The goal here was not to sprinkle noise or not get the simulation exactly right. The goal here in the Golem Project and in many evolutionary robotics experiments since is to rely on diversity, which is what evolutionary algorithms are particularly good at. They don't give you back one optimal solution and prove to you that that's the optimal solution. They give you back a bunch of diverse, good, but not necessarily optimal solutions that are sitting on the tops of various hills in the fitness landscape. And assuming you are able to manufacture large numbers of those evolved simulated robots, then you just hope that at least some of them cross the reality gap. The emergence of 3D printers in the very early 2000s brought in this idea of scalable, low-cost manufacturing, which has, in the last 20 years, revolutionized a lot of branches of engineering. The goal in evolutionary robotics is to combine evolutionary robotics with a 3D printer so that instead of having to snap in all the pieces, we would eventually be able to print all of the robot in the 3D printer and have a robot walk out of the 3D printer. I spoke with Hod around this time and we were talking about that vision. Still not there yet, 20 years later, getting a lot closer, but no one has been able to evolve and 3D print a robot that walks out of the 3D printer. For those that haven't seen a 3D printer in action before, here's a very sped up version of the 3D printer printing one of the bars that makes up the robot in this case. Most of the early 3D printers, and some still do, rely on printing this weak support material, which can be washed away overnight in a dissolving bath that gets rid of all of this additional material and leaves just the bones of the robot. I didn't mention this fact, but the bars themselves have the spring. They can increase and decrease in length, and the vertices where bars connect, the bars are connected with a ball and socket joint, very much like your shoulder. And with some fancy 3D geometry, you can get a 3D printer to print a ball and socket joint with the ball already inside the socket. Yeah? Okay. And then snap in everything else that you can't print. Okay. One of the other nice things about the 3D printing of robotics and the 3D printing in general is, can we print using environmentally friendly materials? Thermoplastic is definitely not an environmentally friendly material, but as we make advances in material science, it may become possible in the not too distant future to print robots and phones and all sorts of other things from environmentally friendly material. When your phone breaks, you throw it in a hopper, and that environmentally friendly material is degraded, and is provided with some material to acceleration that degradation. In this case, they just melted down the thermoplastic. Remember, thermoplastic has a relatively low melting point, and they couldn't do it back then, but there are now thermoplastics that are recyclable. You can melt them down and send them back to the 3D printer to print something else. So we're getting closer to recyclable robotics, not quite there yet. And then, of course, there has to be a reference to the Terminator somewhere in this course. Here's T2 reforming itself. Okay. Luckily, that future doesn't exist and isn't coming anytime soon. All right. With that, let's pause here for today. You have a quiz due tonight. You are finishing up assignment 10. Have a great rest of your week. See you on Tuesday.